Immortality is a costly business, and the currency in ancient Egypt was always human life. For centuries we have looked up, towards the apex of the pyramids, forgetting to look down, towards the foundations stained with effort and pain. The pharaohs, in their desperate search to be gods, violated the laws of biology and ethics. They created a lineage of sick rulers through incest and raised their temples upon a sacrificial workforce. This narrative moves away from the romantic myth to delve into the dark secrets of the Nile. Here there are no supernatural curses, only the cold consequence of human ambition taken to the extreme. Where the preservation of power justified any atrocity and death was one more industry. The flesh of the gods and the forgotten foundations. The history of Egypt does not begin with the brilliance of gold, but with the weight of silence. When we look back towards those sands that have devoured empires and men alike, we usually remain dazzled by the magnificence of the carved stone. We see the pyramids silhouetted against an infinite sky and think of glory, of wisdom, and of a divine connection that modern men have lost. But the greatness of the pharaohs was not built only with blocks of limestone and granite. It was built on secrets that, had they been revealed in the sunlight at the time, would have shaken the foundations of the ancient world. There is a version of history told in schoolbooks and tourist brochures, a version where the pharaohs were wise and just rulers, shepherds of their people and mediators with the gods. But there is another history, one that is hidden in the fractures of the mummies' bones, in the erased texts on the temple walls, and in the tombs that were not meant to be found. The truth is that divinity had a terrible price. To maintain the illusion of being gods on earth, the rulers of the Nile had to cross limits that nature imposes on all living beings. It was not morality that stopped them, nor pity, but only biology and physics. What we today call atrocity, they called divine order. What we see as darkness, they perceived as the blinding light of their own blood. To truly understand who these men and women were who sat on the throne of the two lands, we must dare to look at what they hid under the linen bandages. They were not perfect beings sculpted in diorite. They were humans trapped in a web of belief so absolute that it justified pain, sickness, and mass death as necessary tools to maintain the balance of the cosmos. This is the chronicle of that darkness. It is not a story of monsters, but of men who wanted to be more than men and who, in their attempt, left a trail of suffering that has taken millennia to surface. What few people stop to consider when observing the funeral mask of a pharaoh is the fragility that was hidden behind the gold. The projected image was that of an eternal, strong, virile, and perfect being, a living incarnation of Horus, the falcon god. However, the biological reality of the royal family was often a nightmare of chronic pain and physical weakness. The reason for this was not found in an external curse, nor in the wrath of the gods, but in a deliberate and political decision that was maintained for centuries, the preservation of the royal blood at any cost. In the Egyptian mentality, the pharaoh was not a simple king chosen by right of conquest or inheritance. He was a being of a different substance than the rest of the mortals. His blood was considered golden, divine, a sacred fluid that could not be mixed with the common blood of the subjects without losing its magical potency. To maintain that purity, the pharaohs resorted to the only available source that guaranteed theological legitimacy, their own family. What modern science today identifies as a catastrophic error, for them was the fulfillment of a sacred myth. They imitated the primordial gods, Isis and Osiris, brother and wife, whose union had given rise to the order of the world. But biology does not forgive, not even kings. This practice, which extended from the earliest dynasties to the end of the Ptolemaic era, created a scenario where the royal family tree did not branch out, but rather closed in on itself in increasingly narrower circles. Fathers united with daughters, brothers with sisters, uncles with nieces. They did not do it out of depravity, nor did they seek the forbidden pleasure that the modern mind might imagine. They did it out of duty. It was a theological burden. They firmly believed that by diluting their blood with that of a stranger, they put the stability of the universe itself at risk. The consequence of this belief was a slow and silent devastation that corroded the most powerful dynasty in history from within. The most emblematic case, and perhaps the most tragic, is that of the dynasty 18. For decades, Egyptologists marveled at the richness of Tutankhamun's tomb, but overlooked the story told by his own remains. When technology allowed a look beyond the mummified skin, what emerged was not the image of a conquering warrior. The young king was a fragile boy tormented by pain. His bones told the story of generations of accumulated consanguineous unions. He had a cleft palate, a painfully curving spine, and a deformed foot that prevented him from walking without help. The canes found in his tomb were not symbols of authority or scepters of command. They were necessary tools for him to stand upright. The tragedy of Tutankhamun was not an isolated accident. It was the predictable result of a system that ignored natural laws. His father, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, and his mother, whose remains indicate she was Akhenaten's full sister, bequeathed him a genetic map full of errors. Nature, in its indifference, collected the price of theological arrogance. The young pharaoh's immune system was so weak that a simple fracture, combined with a malaria infection, was enough to end his life before he reached 20 years old. He was not assassinated by a conspiracy in the shadows, nor by a coup d'etat, but by the very blood his family had tried to protect with such zeal. This obsession with purity had consequences that went beyond the monarch's health. It affected the succession and the stability of the kingdom. Pregnancies in the royal court frequently ended in silent tragedies. In the very tomb of Tutankhamun, 2 small coffins were found. Inside them rested the mummified bodies of 2 fetuses, his daughters, born from his union with his half-sister Ankhesenamun. Neither of them ever breathed. One of them showed severe deformities, silent evidence that the royal genetics had reached a breaking point. The lineage of the great conquerors, of the empire builders, was extinguished not on the battlefield, but in the solitude of a birthing chamber, incapable of producing a viable heir. The irony is cruel and perfect. The pharaohs sought eternal life and divine perfection through these unions, but what they achieved was exactly the opposite: weakness, sickness, and premature extinction. They created a caste of rulers who, far from being supermen, were often invalids, dependent on their courtiers, ruling an empire from the fragility of bodies that could barely stand. However, the people did not see this. The state propaganda machine, through colossal statues and idealized reliefs, hid the truth. The pharaoh was always represented young, athletic, and perfect. The lie was carved in stone to last forever, while the truth rotted in silence under the bandages. The foundations of blood. If biology was an invisible enemy for the pharaohs, death was the final enemy they had to conquer. But in the dawn of Egyptian civilization, the conception of royal death was very different from what we imagine today. It was not just about mummifying the body and surrounding it with inanimate treasures. In the earliest dynasties, the belief was much more literal and much darker. The pharaoh, upon dying, did not cease to be king. His journey to the afterlife, to the kingdom of Osiris, or to navigate the heavens with Ra, required a court, and a court needs servants. For a long time, archaeologists excavating in the sacred sands of Abydos, the burial place of the first kings, found a disturbing pattern around the great royal tombs. Hundreds of smaller tombs surrounded the monarch, arranged in orderly rows, like an army awaiting an order. At first it was believed that these people had died of natural causes over the years and had asked to be buried near their lord. It was a comforting explanation, but modern forensic science destroyed that illusion. Analyses of the remains found around the tombs of pharaohs like Jer or Aha revealed a chilling truth. Everyone had died at the same time. They were young men, healthy women, skilled artisans, court dwarves, and even favorite animals. There were no signs of illness or old age. The conclusion was inevitable. They had been brought there to die. They were not captured enemies or condemned criminals. They were the king's inner circle. Their loyalty did not end with the pharaoh's last breath. It was demanded that they follow him into the darkness. Imagine the scene under the relentless desert sun 5,000 years ago. The king's funeral was not just a moment of mourning, but a ritual of mass execution. The funeral procession included those who had been chosen for the supreme honor. We do not know for sure what was going through their minds. Did they feel fear, or was the faith in the pharaoh's divinity so absolute that they saw their own death as a direct passage to paradise? The evidence suggests a mix of both. In some tombs, the bodies show no signs of extreme physical violence, indicating that they may have drunk poison or some potent narcotic in a ritualized act, falling into a sleep from which they never woke. But in other cases, the story is different. There are necks with strangulation marks. There are positions that suggest some were buried before life completely abandoned them. The reality of human sacrifice in ancient Egypt was a secret that Egyptian culture itself tried to forget over time. Towards the end of the First Dynasty, this practice abruptly disappeared. It was replaced by the ushebtis, those small magical faience or wooden figurines that fill museums today. The Egyptians decided that magic could replace blood. A statuette, if the correct prayers were said, could come to life in the afterlife and serve the pharaoh just like a servant of flesh and blood. This change marks one of the most important moments in the moral evolution of humanity, but it does not erase the blood from the foundations. The first great structures, the very concept of the divine monarchy, was forged upon the idea that the lives of others were the property of the king. The pharaoh had the right to consume the lives of his people to ensure his own eternity. Those hundreds of skeletons in Abydos are the silent testimony of an era in which power had no ethical limits. And yet, even when mass sacrifices ceased, the shadow of ritual violence never entirely left the Nile. Death transformed, becoming more selective, more symbolic, but no less real. In times of crisis, when the Nile did not rise and famine threatened to devour the land, the veil of civilization was torn. There are dark mentions, texts that scribes preferred not to copy, about moments when hunger led men to look upon their fellow men not as brothers, but as sustenance. Although this was not state policy, the chaos that followed the fall of a strong kingdom revealed the fragility of the human order. The power of the pharaoh, his ability to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order, was the only thing that separated Egypt from absolute chaos. And to maintain that order, any sacrifice, whether of his own family through incest or of servants through ritual, was considered an acceptable price. The Egyptian social pyramid was a machine designed to elevate a single individual towards the stars, and the fuel for that machine was, invariably, the suffering and obedience of the multitude. Among all the secrets that later priests and pharaohs tried to erase from the face of the earth, none was as dangerous as the reign of Akhenaten. If the other pharaohs sought to maintain the established order, Akhenaten sought to break it into 1,000 pieces. His story is that of a man who looked up at the sky and decided that everything his civilization had believed for millennia was a lie. It was not just a political change, it was a spiritual cataclysm that shook the soul of Egypt. When Amenhotep IV ascended the throne, the clergy of Amun was the most powerful force in the country, possessing lands, wealth and influence that rivaled those of the pharaoh himself. But the new king had a different vision. He changed his name to Akhenaten, he who is useful to Aten, and declared that all the gods of the Egyptian pantheon, those animal-headed figures that had guided humanity since the beginning of time, were false. Only one existed, the solar disk, pure, abstract and distant light. What followed was a systematic purge. The name of Amun was chiseled and erased from the temples. The priests were stripped of their power. The king abandoned the traditional capital Thebes and marched into the desert to build a utopian city in a place where no one had set foot before, Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten, today known as Amarna. In record time he erected palaces and open-air temples dedicated to worshipping the light. But behind this theological revolution were hidden behaviors that scandalized his contemporaries and that continue to baffle historians today. The art of Amarna is the key to understanding the mystery. For the first time in Egyptian history, the pharaoh was not shown as an idealized warrior. He was shown as he was, or as he wanted to be seen, with a strangely elongated skull, wide and feminine hips, a prominent belly and thick lips. Was this brutal realism or esoteric symbolism? Some experts suggest that Akhenaten suffered from Marfan syndrome or some other genetic condition, a product once again of the inbreeding of his ancestors. Others believe he tried to represent himself as an androgynous being, a mother and a father to his people, just like his god Aten, who encompassed both genders. But the darkness of Amarna does not reside in the aesthetics, but in what happened within the walls of the royal palace. Akhenaten's devotion to his god bordered on fanaticism, and his isolation from political reality had dire consequences. While the king wrote hymns to the sun and had himself represented kissing his daughters under the beneficent rays of Aten, the borders of Egypt were burning. The Amarna letters, clay tablets found in the ruins of the city, are desperate testimonies from governors and vassal kings in Canaan and Syria asking for help against invaders. The king must send archers. If there are no archers this year, all the king's lands will be lost, they pleaded. But Akhenaten did not answer. His gaze was fixed on the sun, blind to the suffering of his empire. Within the royal family, the situation was even more murky. The figure of Nefertiti, the great royal wife, whose beauty has crossed the millennia, mysteriously disappears from the records towards the end of the reign. Did she die? Did she fall from grace? Or, as some bold theories suggest, did she ascend the throne as co-regent under a male name, becoming pharaoh in her own right? What we do know is that Akhenaten elevated his own daughter Meritaten to the position of great royal wife after the disappearance of her mother. The line between religious piety and abuse of power blurred in the court of the solar disk. The end of this experiment was abrupt and violent. After Akhenaten's death, the reaction was relentless. Tutankhamun, his son, was forced to restore the old gods and abandon his father's city. Amarna was left to the desert. Its stones were dismantled and used as filler for other buildings. Akhenaten's name was erased from the lists of kings. They referred to him simply as the enemy of Akhetaten. The Egyptians tried to perform an act of reverse magic. If they erased his name, they erased his existence and the trauma he had caused. But the ruins remained, and with them the evidence that even the son of the sun could lose his reason. The Whisper of the Sands. Up to this point, we have only lifted one corner of the veil. We have seen how royal blood poisoned itself in search of purity, how the first kings demanded company in death, and how a pharaoh tried to rewrite the sky and ended up destroying his land. But the secrets of Egypt are deep like the Nile in flood. We have not yet spoken of the true nature of pyramid construction, far from the whip but close to physical agony. We have not entered the embalming chambers, where respect for the body was mixed with rituals of necessary butchery. Nor have we explored the most famous conspiracy of all, the one involving the last queen, Cleopatra, and her final struggle not only for a throne, but for the survival of her civilization. The story continues. What lies beneath the sand is not always dead. Sometimes it is just waiting to be told. In the next stage of our journey, we will descend into the tombs of the laborers and enter the halls of justice, where traitors were judged with punishments that defy imagination, because in Egypt the line between justice and vengeance was as thin as a sheet of papyrus. There is a persistent myth, fueled by popular culture and cinema, that imagines the pyramids being built by legions of foreign slaves, men chained under the whip of ruthless foremen. The archaeological reality, however, tells us a different story, one that is perhaps more unsettling because it speaks not of forced slavery, but of a compulsory and systemic devotion. The truth of what happened on the Giza Plateau was so complex that it took us millennia to unearth it. The builders were not slaves in the classic sense, but Egyptian citizens recruited through a system of rotating labor known as corvée. They were farmers, peasants, and artisans who, during the Nile flood season, when the land could not be cultivated, were mobilized by the state to serve the pharaoh. But being free did not mean their fate was benevolent. Recent excavations in the city of the workers, at the foot of the pyramids, have revealed the physical price of this titanic labor. The unearthed skeletons tell a story of chronic pain and superhuman effort. The vast majority of the skeletal remains show signs of severe degenerative arthritis in the spine and knees, even in men and women who were barely over 30 years old. Their bodies were literally compressed by the burden. Healed fractures have been found in arms and legs that suggest constant accidents, falls from dizzying heights, or crushing by 2.5-ton blocks of limestone. The surprising thing is not just the number of injuries, but the fact that many were healed. This indicates that there was a system of medical care, a kind of primitive social security, not out of compassion but out of necessity. A dead worker was useless, but a mended worker could return to dragging stones. So many died or were crippled that the workers' cemetery grew almost as fast as the pyramid itself. The construction of the Great Pyramid of Khufu was not a miracle of acoustic levitation or alien technology. It was the triumph of bureaucratic organization over human fragility. The pharaoh mobilized a workforce of 20,000 men for 20 years, feeding them with massive rations of bread, beer, onions, and dried fish. For the state, these men were gears, units of biological energy that had to be maintained at the lowest possible cost to ensure maximum performance. This part was hidden, but is fundamental to understanding the Egyptian psyche. The pyramid was not only a tomb, but a national unification project. Shared pain cemented loyalty to the state. However, the scale of the sacrifice is difficult to comprehend today. Let us imagine the deafening noise of copper chisels hitting the limestone for 12 hours a day under a sun that raised the temperature to 40 degrees Celsius. Silica dust filled the quarryman's lungs, causing silicosis and a slow death by suffocation years after the work ended. The glory of the pharaoh was raised upon a mountain of shattered lungs and broken backs. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but an absolute indifference to individual suffering in the face of the cosmic necessity of preserving the king. If the construction of the tombs required the sacrifice of the living, the preparation of the dead required the systematic violation of nature. Mummification is perhaps the most distinctive feature of Egyptian culture, a practice that seeks to stop decomposition and maintain the human form for the return of the soul. But behind the golden masks and the impeccable linen bandages, the process was a ritualized butchery, a bloody craft carried out by a class of priests and technicians who lived on the margins of society, feared and respected at the same time. The place where this transformation occurred was called Per Nefer, or the House of Beauty, a poetic euphemism for a sacred slaughterhouse. What happened inside there was strictly codified, but it was still an act of violence against the body. To preserve the mortal shell, it first had to be emptied. The extraction of the brain is well known, but the details are gruesome. A metal hook was inserted through the nostrils to break the ethmoid bone and churn the brain mass until it became liquid, which was then drained by tilting the body. What could not be removed with the hook was dissolved by injecting caustic resins. The brain, considered useless by the Egyptians, was discarded without ceremony. The evisceration of the torso was equally brutal. An incision was made in the left flank with an obsidian knife, a volcanic stone sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. Through there, the embalmer inserted his hand to tear out the lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines. The heart, the seat of intelligence and emotion, was left in place or replaced by a stone scarab if accidentally damaged. The empty body was stuffed with natron, a natural salt that dried the flesh until it resembled cured leather. The smell in these workshops must have been unbearable, a mixture of burnt incense, decaying flesh, blood, and strong chemicals. No one ever wondered why the embalmers lived separately, but the answer lies in the impure nature of their work. They touched death daily, but there were even darker secrets in the mummification workshops than the simple manipulation of corpses. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt centuries after the construction of the pyramids, collected rumors that circulated in hushed tones. He recounted that when a young and beautiful noblewoman died, her body was not immediately delivered to the embalmers. The family waited 3 or 4 days until decomposition began to become evident. The reason was the fear of desecration. There was a fear, founded on real cases, that some embalmers, men who spent their lives among corpses, would succumb to dark impulses and abuse the fresh bodies of royal women before opening them. This necrophilia, although severely punished if discovered, was a latent risk in such a macabre profession. The fact that families had to take precautions by letting their loved ones decay before handing them over speaks of a deep distrust towards those tasked with guaranteeing eternity. The sanctity of the funerary ritual coexisted with the lowest perversions of the human condition. Furthermore, mummification was a lucrative and often corrupt business. Not everyone received the same treatment. There were first-class mummifications for the royalty, where the best oils, resins imported from Lebanon, and pure gold were used to cover the incisions. But for the middle and lower class, the process was much rougher. Cedar oil was often injected through the rectum to liquefy the internal organs without the need to open the body, a cheap and painful form of preservation. And in times of economic crisis, the embalming workshops recycled coffins and bandages. Mummies have been found wrapped in papyri that were actually discarded administrative documents or personal letters, and bodies placed in sarcophagi that bore the name of another person, simply repainted. In the death market, fraud was commonplace. The promise of eternal life was sold to the highest bidder, and if you could not pay, your eternity was second-hand. The harem conspiracy. While the workers were dying in the quarries and the embalmers were emptying corpses, another type of darkness was brewing in the royal palaces. The pharaoh's harem was not simply a place of domestic pleasure. It was a political institution, a golden cage where hundreds of women, secondary wives, concubines and their children fiercely competed for the monarch's attention and, above all, for the succession to the throne. Where there is absolute power and disputed inheritance, murder becomes just one more political tool. One of the most dramatic and best documented episodes in Egyptian history is the so-called harem conspiracy, a plot to assassinate the pharaoh Ramesses III, the last great king of the New Kingdom. Egypt was in decline, the economy was faltering, worker strikes were common, and administrative corruption was eating away at the state. In this climate of instability, one of the king's secondary wives, a woman named Tyre, decided that her son, Prince Pentuer, should be pharaoh instead of the legitimate heir. The truth of what was happening was so complex that it involved almost every stratum of the court. Tyre did not act alone. She recruited high officials, the royal steward, the chief cupbearer, and even priests who had access to the sacred texts in the temple library. What makes this conspiracy unique is the documented use of black magic as a weapon of regicide. The conspirators did not only rely on poison or the dagger, they fashioned wax dolls in the image of the pharaoh and his guards, recited forbidden spells to weaken their limbs and cloud their minds. They believed that magic could alter physical reality, paralyzing the divine protection that surrounded the king. The plan was executed during the celebration of the Valley Festival at Medinet Habu, when security was laxer. For decades, historians debated whether the plot was successful. The judicial papyri that survived, known as the Turin Judicial Papyrus, narrate the trial of the conspirators but are ambiguous about the king's fate, referring to him as the Great God, which implies he was already dead during the process. The definitive answer came a few years ago, thanks to modern technology. A computerized tomography scan of the mummy of Ramesses III revealed a secret that had been hidden under a thick bandage on his neck for 3,000 years. The pharaoh had been slit at the throat. The images showed a deep and brutal cut in the throat, so severe that it reached the vertebrae, severing the trachea, the esophagus, and the major blood vessels. He died in a matter of seconds. The conspiracy had succeeded in its primary objective, killing the living god, but it failed in its political objective. The legitimate heir, Ramesses IV, quickly took control, arrested the traitors, and organized a tribunal to judge them. What followed was a ruthless purge. The fate of the conspirators was atrocious, but the most disturbing punishment was reserved for Prince Pentuer, the son for whom the royal blood had been spilled. His mummy, known for years as the Screaming Mummy or the Individual E, was found in an unnamed royal cache, without inscriptions and without the honors due to a prince. His face, frozen in an expression of eternal agony with his mouth open, has terrified researchers since its discovery. Forensic and genetic analysis confirmed that he was the son of Ramesses III. But his burial was an act of eternal condemnation. He was wrapped in sheepskin, a material considered ritually impure by the ancient Egyptians, which implied that he was unclean in the eyes of the gods. His organs were not removed, and his body was desiccated quickly, almost carelessly. Marks on his neck suggest he died by strangulation or hanging. Most likely he was granted the privilege of taking his own life to avoid a public execution, but his soul was condemned to oblivion. By not having his name written on his tomb or his coffin, according to Egyptian theology, he could not be called before the tribunal of Osiris. He was condemned to non-existence, to wander eternally in the void, a punishment worse than physical death for the Egyptian mind. The trial recorded in the Turin Papyrus is fascinating for its administrative coldness. The judges sentenced dozens of officials to death. Some had their noses and ears cut off before execution, marking them as traitors. The harem women involved disappeared from history. Tyre, the mastermind, simply ceases to be mentioned, her fate lost in the silence of the records. This episode reveals that the pharaonic court, far from being a place of celestial harmony, was a nest of vipers where a mother's ambition could lead to regicide and the destruction of her own lineage. While the royalty killed each other, another dark secret flourished in the temples, one that involved millions of living beings and a religious scam on an industrial scale. The Egyptians worshipped their gods in animal forms: the falcon, the cat, the ibis, the crocodile. Over time, this devotion evolved into the practice of offering animal mummies as ex-votos to the gods. A pilgrim visiting a temple would buy a cat mummy to offer to the goddess Bastet, hoping to receive a blessing or a healing. The demand for these offerings grew so much that it became a massive industry. Catacombs have been discovered in Saqqara and Tuna El Gabel that contain millions of animal mummies, stacked from floor to ceiling in kilometer-long galleries. But when modern scientists scanned these packages with X-rays, they discovered the truth of the scam. A very high percentage of these mummies, perhaps 1/3, are empty. They contain only sticks, mud, feathers, or a few loose bones, carefully wrapped to resemble a complete animal. The priests tasked with raising and sacrificing the sacred animals could not keep up with the demand, so they began to fake the offerings. They sold the faithful pilgrims, who had often traveled for days and spent their savings, packages of sacred garbage. It was an economy based on a pious lie. Furthermore, the treatment of the actual animals was horrendous. Many cats were raised on industrial farms annexed to the temples and systematically sacrificed when young, often by breaking the neck or hitting the head to turn them into marketable products. The animal cult, often seen as a display of Egyptian respect for nature, hid a reality of massive exploitation and religious deception. The faith of the common people was an inexhaustible source of income for the clergy, and the production of divine messengers was managed with the same coldness as the production of grain or bricks. Millions of creatures were sacrificed not out of reverence, but for profit, their bodies turned into currency to buy divine favors that would never arrive. We have traveled the stone paths stained with sweat and blood. We have entered the chambers where the rest of the dead was violated, and we have witnessed betrayal in the heart of the palace. The image of Egypt is being completed, and it is no longer the golden postcard of tourism. It is an image of human power, raw and unfiltered. But the history of the dark secrets does not end with the new kingdom. We still have the final chapter, the outcome of a civilization that, in its agony, produced some of its most intense dramas. We approach the time when Egypt ceased to be its own master, when foreign dynasties occupied the throne and the shadow of Rome began to lengthen over the Nile. In the next and final part, we will explore the end of the pharaohs, the excesses of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the final manipulation of Cleopatra, and how ancient knowledge was transformed into superstition and forbidden alchemy. We will see how even in its death, the Egyptian civilization cast one last curse on the world. The eternal fascination that centuries later would lead explorers to madness and death in the Valley of the Kings. The sun sets over the pyramids, but the shadows lengthen more than ever. The twilight of the gods and the vengeance of the dead. The sun that had shone over the pyramids for 3 millennia began to decline, not with a sudden burst, but with a long and agonizing shadow that covered the Nile Valley. We had seen how the pharaohs built their divinity upon the blood of their families and the sweat of their people. We had explored the secret chambers where death was turned into industry. But the final chapter of the history of ancient Egypt is perhaps the most disturbing, because it is not about the rise of a civilization, but about its absolute corruption and its fall. It is a chronicle of decay, where the last rulers, foreigners in a strange land, adopted the vices of the ancient kings and raised them to new heights of depravity. And it is also the story of how, long after the temples fell silent, the dead found a way to continue claiming lives. Official history usually stops at the greatness of Ramesses or the mystery of the pyramids, overlooking the final centuries under Greek rule. However, it was under the Ptolemaic dynasty that the darkest secrets of the court became state policy. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he was received as a liberator, but his successors, the Ptolemies, transformed the throne into a stage for family tragedy that would make any fictional drama pale. They were not Egyptian by blood, but Macedonians, Greeks who brought with them the philosophy and logic of the West, but who were seduced by the absolute power offered by the double crown of the Nile. What not everyone knows is that the Ptolemies took the practice of royal incest to an extreme that the native pharaohs themselves would have found excessive. While the ancient kings married their sisters to preserve the divine blood, the Ptolemies did it out of a sickly political paranoia. They trusted no one outside their own womb. For almost 300 years, the royal family closed in on itself in a suffocating genetic loop. Uncles married nieces, brothers married sisters, and mothers conspired against sons. The genealogy of this dynasty is not a tree, but a tangled web where the names obsessively repeat: Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Berenice, Arsinoe. This inbreeding produced rulers of sharp and dangerous intelligence, but also of manifest mental instability. Ptolemy IV, for example, was a king dominated by his favorites, given over to Dionysian excesses while the state crumbled. It is said that he murdered his own mother, Berenice II, and his brother to secure his throne, inaugurating a tradition of matricide and fratricide that would become the norm. The court of Alexandria, with its famous library and its lighthouse illuminating the Mediterranean, was at the same time a nest of vipers where a family dinner could end in poisoning, and where exile was the most merciful sentence a brother could expect from another. The case of Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon for his morbid obesity, illustrates the depth of this darkness. His reign was a catalogue of horrors. He married his sister, Cleopatra II, then repudiated her to marry her daughter, his own niece, Cleopatra III. The civil war that erupted between the family members devastated Alexandria. In an act of cruelty that defines his legacy, Ptolemy VIII murdered his own son, born of his sister, and sent the child's dismembered remains to the mother as a birthday gift. This was not the behavior of a living god, but that of a tyrant consumed by absolute power without moral restrictions. The divinity of the pharaoh had become an excuse for domestic barbarism. In the midst of this genetic and political chaos, the last and most famous queen of Egypt was born, Cleopatra VII. However, to understand her psyche, one must first comprehend the rottenness of her family tree. The Ptolemaic dynasty was not a family. It was a nest of vipers that had been marrying siblings and murdering each other for centuries for control of the Nile Delta. Cleopatra was not an anomaly, but the final and perfected product of generations of intrigue and poisoned blood. Popular culture and cinema have preferred to portray her in a soft light, as a romantic seductress, a femme fatale who used her exotic beauty to cloud the judgment of the Roman generals. But the historical truth is much colder, more calculating, and terrifying. Cleopatra was not a tragic lover dragged by passions. She was a brutal survivor in a world where her own family, the people who shared her table and her blood, wanted her dead. The reality hidden behind the myth of the reincarnated goddess Isis is that Cleopatra was a ruthless strategist, directly responsible for the systematic execution of her own siblings to secure a power she was unwilling to share. From the moment she ascended the throne at 18 years old, she understood that in the court of Alexandria there were no relatives, only rivals. Her first obstacle was her own husband and younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Far from being a ceremonial marriage, their relationship was a veiled civil war. When Ptolemy, manipulated by his regents, expelled her from the palace and forced her into exile, Cleopatra did not retreat to mourn her misfortune. She orchestrated her return with military precision, using the arrival of Julius Caesar not out of love, but as one who acquires a high-level mercenary. The War of Alexandria that followed was brutal, and the result was the physical elimination of her first rival. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, weighted down by his own golden armor while fleeing from the Roman legions his sister had brought to his doors. It was a victory that Cleopatra observed without remorse. But the list of family threats did not end there. After the death of the first one, tradition and politics forced her to marry her other younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. For a time the young man was a harmless puppet beside the pharaoh, but Cleopatra knew that children grow and with them ambition grows. The death of this second brother is one of the darkest chapters of her reign. He died mysteriously in the year 44 before Christ, a suspiciously convenient date just after Cleopatra gave birth to Caesarion, her son with Caesar. Ancient sources and modern historians agree it was not a sudden illness, but poison. Cleopatra eliminated her brother-husband to make way for her son, ensuring that the line of succession was hers and no one else's. However, the most ruthless act, the one that demonstrates the true nature of her character, was the murder of her younger sister, Arsinoe IV. Arsinoe was not a passive threat. She had had the audacity to declare herself queen during the war against Caesar and had led troops against Cleopatra. After being defeated, Arsinoe sought refuge in the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey. In the ancient world, a temple was an inviolable place. Neither kings nor armies could touch those who took refuge in the protection of the gods. But for Cleopatra, the existence of a sister with royal blood and political ambition was an intolerable risk that no divine law could protect. Years after the conflict, Cleopatra used her influence, this time over Mark Antony, to demand the unthinkable. She did not ask for a territory or a treasure, she asked for her sister's head. Roman troops burst into the sacred temple, an act of sacrilege that shocked the Mediterranean world, and dragged Arsinoe from the altar steps to execute her. It was not a crime of passion, it was a cold and bureaucratic dynastic cleansing. The woman who spoke 9 languages, who wrote medical treatises and debated philosophy with the wise men of the Library of Alexandria, did not hesitate for a second to stain her hands with the blood of her own kin to remain at the top of the pyramid. The end of Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic dynasty marked the definitive closure of 3,000 years of pharaonic history. But even her death, shrouded in the romantic legend of the asp cobra, was actually a final act of absolute control. After the defeat at Actium, Cleopatra saw the future that awaited her at the hands of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. She knew that Rome had no pity. The fate of captured kings was to be chained, dragged through the mud, and exhibited in the streets of Rome during the triumphal parade, to be finally strangled in a dark cell while the plebs cheered. Cleopatra, proud and lucid until the last second, denied Rome that pleasure. Her voluntary disappearance was not an act of desperation by an abandoned lover, but a final, defiant political decision. She deprived the victor of his greatest trophy. She chose the time, the place, and the method of her departure, maintaining her royal dignity intact as her body cooled. With her last breath, Egypt ceased to be a divine and sovereign kingdom to become a simple province, a massive granary designed to feed the machinery of the empire that had conquered it. The final profanation, mummies as medicine. One might think that with the disappearance of the last native dynasties, the twilight of the animal-headed gods, and the successive rise of Christianity and then Islam in the Mediterranean basin, the ancient kings of the two lands would finally rest in peace. They had spent millennia building the grandest final dwellings humanity had ever seen, designed to withstand the passage of time and ensure a safe transit to the field of reeds. But fate, with its usual irony, had reserved for them a final humiliation, a grotesque epilogue that not even their worst nightmares, plagued with demons of the underworld, could have predicted. During the Middle Ages, and more intensely in the Renaissance and the European Baroque, while the West was rediscovering classical philosophy and art, a secret trade emerged in the shadows that constitutes perhaps the most macabre chapter in the history of Egyptology and Western medicine, the systematic ingestion of the ancient dead of the Nile. Illustration of a Renaissance pharmacy with jars labeled Mumia. No one at the time questioned the profound ethical implications of what they were doing. The pharmacies of Europe, from the alleys of Venice to the royal apothecaries of London and Paris, were filled with glass jars labelled with a word that promised miracles, mumia. The genesis of this horror is based on a tragic error of translation and medical superstition. The Persian word mumia originally referred to bitumen, a black resinous substance that naturally seeped from the earth in certain regions of the Middle East and was used to heal wounds and fractures. When the first European travelers arrived in Egypt and saw the embalmed bodies, darkened by the centuries and the resins applied during the funerary rituals, they mistakenly assumed that this dark substance was the same healing bitumen. They believed that the ancient Egyptians had discovered a way to saturate the human body with this vital substance. This linguistic confusion unleashed an insatiable demand. It was believed that the resulting powder from grinding these ancient bodies possessed the concentrated life force of millennia, a panacea capable of curing all types of ailments, from persistent headaches and stomach ulcers to coagulation problems and even epilepsy. Kings like Francis I of France did not travel anywhere without a small bag of this powder, fearful of running out of their miraculous remedy. European society, which called itself the pinnacle of civilization and reason, practiced a routine medicinal cannibalism for centuries, literally feeding on the remains of one of the greatest civilizations of antiquity. The demand for ancient bodies was so high that the natural supplies quickly ran out. Local tomb robbers in Egypt, who for generations had lived off the discreet theft of gold amulets, found themselves facing a new large-scale industry. They no longer sought only jewels, they sought the flesh and bone themselves. An unprecedented fever of desecration broke out. The mummies of high priests, court nobles, scribes, and possibly forgotten pharaohs of minor dynasties were brutally ripped from their painted sarcophagi. Their sacred linen bandages, inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead to protect the soul on its journey, were discarded as trash. The bodies were transported on camelback towards Cairo and Alexandria, where they were crushed in large industrial mortars or fragmented to be shipped in the holds of merchant ships to European ports. It is a devastating irony that defies comprehension. Kings who had mobilized the economy of an entire nation to build stone monuments with the sole purpose of living eternally ended up converted into medicinal powder in the stomachs of European merchants, apothecaries and aristocrats, digested and finally discarded by the very living who admired their pyramids. When authentic mummies inevitably began to run low due to the exhaustive looting of known necropolises, the market did not stop. The greed of unscrupulous merchants led to an even darker second phase, the industrial counterfeiting of ancient relics. Clandestine workshops sprang up in the alleys of Cairo and Alexandria. Merchants took the fresh corpses of criminals who had met their end in prisons, of anonymous beggars who had died in the streets, or of victims of periodic plagues. These recent bodies were subjected to an accelerated aging process. They were stuffed with cheap asphalt, straw and old rags. They were dried in the scorching desert sun for weeks, until the skin acquired a leathery, dark texture, similar to that of the ancient embalmings. Then they were wrapped in crudely aged linens and sold to naive European buyers as authentic relics of the age of the pharaohs. For centuries, much of the mumia consumed in Europe did not even come from ancient Egypt, but were the tragic remains of the less fortunate contemporaries of North Africa. It was a final violation, a total destruction of the physical identity, the cart, and the name, the Ren, the two elements that the Egyptians had valued more than anything else in the world to ensure their existence in the afterlife. It is unsettling to note that this morbid and utilitarian fascination with human remains is not exclusive to Europe's relationship with Egypt. If we look at other cultures, we find echoes of this practice. In ancient Rome, there was a belief that drinking the warm blood of a fallen gladiator in the arena could cure epilepsy and transmit his vigor and bravery. It was a transfer of life force through direct consumption. Similarly, in ancient Chinese traditional medicine, certain human body parts and even fossilized bones, often called dragon bones, were used in concoctions for various ailments, under the premise that they contained potent spiritual essences. Perhaps the strangest parallel is found in the legend of the mellified man in the Middle East, described in 16th century Chinese sources. It was said that holy old men, near the end of their lives, would submit to an exclusive diet of honey until their bodies were saturated with it. After their death, they were submerged in coffins full of honey for a century. The result, a preserved human confection, was sold at exorbitant prices as a supreme remedy for broken bones and wounds. Although these practices differ in method and scale, they all share a common psychological root: the magical belief that the death of others can be harvested to prolong one's own life, and that the human body retains a residual energy that can be extracted. However, the industrial scale and cultural distance with which Europe consumed Egypt remains a unique case of historical predation. As the modern era advanced and archaeology ceased to be a treasure hunt to become a methodical science, a new, more subtle but equally dangerous layer of darkness emerged, the so-called Curse of the Pharaoh. Although the sensationalist media of the 1920s and 1930s turned the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb into a global media circus, speaking of vengeful spirits and ancestral revenges, the basis of these legends has roots in real facts and very tangible biological and geological dangers. The idea that the dead can harm the living is not just magic. It is often advanced biology and chemistry. When Howard Carter broke the clay seal of Tutankhamun's intact tomb in 1922 and the light of his candle flickered as he peered inside, he was not just seeing wonderful things. He was releasing air that had been stagnant, hermetically sealed for over 3,000 years. In the silent darkness and stable temperature of these subterranean chambers, certain organisms not only survived but thrived in a state of latency, awaiting a new host. Modern studies have shown that Egyptian tombs are perfect reservoirs for dangerous molds and fungi. The food offerings left for the deceased, the layers of linen, and the organic matter of the poorly cured mummies themselves are ideal breeding grounds. Fungi such as Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus can release microscopic spores that, when inhaled, are potentially lethal to people with weakened immune systems. These spores can cause aspergillosis, a severe and rapidly progressing lung infection. Lord Carnarvon, the financial patron of the expedition, and a man whose health was already fragile due to a previous car accident that had damaged his lungs, was one of the first notable victims. He died in Cairo shortly after the tomb opening. The official cause was an infected mosquito bite that led to pneumonia and septicemia. But was it the magical revenge of the boy king, or the sudden exposure to concentrated ancient pathogens, combined with the fragile health of an English aristocrat unaccustomed to the Egyptian climate? Science leans towards the latter, but the timing of his death fueled the legend forever. Beyond the fungi and bacteria, there is a bolder theory, one that borders on science fiction but has some geological basis: the impact of radiation. Studies carried out in some deep tombs of the Old and Middle Kingdom have detected abnormally high levels of radon gas. Radon is a radioactive, odorless and colorless gas that is a natural byproduct of the disintegration of uranium, a trace element often found in the limestone and granite rock used in the construction of tombs and pyramids. In an open space, radon dissipates harmlessly, but in a hermetically sealed underground chamber for millennia, the gas can accumulate to reach dangerous concentrations. Some theorists suggest an unsettling possibility. Is it possible that the ancient Egyptian architects and priests, with their deep knowledge of the earth and minerals, knew the harmful properties of certain shiny rocks or specific strata? It is not necessary for them to have understood nuclear physics to observe that those who worked too long in certain quarries or with certain materials became mysteriously ill. Could they have deliberately chosen to build the burial chambers in specific geological zones to turn them into slow radioactive traps? Those tomb robbers or archaeologists who spent too much time breathing the stale air inside the funerary chambers could have been exposed to significant doses of radiation. This would not kill them instantly, like an Indiana Jones mechanical trap, but would drastically increase the risk of developing serious illnesses years later. This deferred revenge would perfectly fit the nature of a curse that seems supernatural due to its delayed effect, but is actually purely geological. This theory leads us to consider whether other ancient civilizations possessed similar knowledge about dangerous materials. Let us think about the tomb of the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, which is supposedly surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury, a highly toxic metal intended to deter intruders with deadly vapors. The idea that the ancients protected their sacred places with more than just stone is a global constant. Regardless of biology or geology, the truth is that the curse functioned as an extraordinarily effective psychological defense mechanism. The ancient Egyptians protected their tombs not only with granite walls and false passages, but with primal fear. In a society where magic was a force as real as gravity, words had power. The inscriptions that warned that death will come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the pharaoh, or that threatened that the transgressor would be devoured by Amit, the devourer of souls, were not empty rhetoric. They were the first psychic security barrier in history, and it worked. For centuries, fear kept many away, and when the Europeans arrived, the chain of sudden illnesses, tragic ends, and misfortunes that pursued some members of the archaeological expeditions fueled the cultural narrative that there are doors that humanity should not open. The human mind seeks patterns, and it is easy to connect the desecration of a sacred tomb with a later misfortune, ignoring the statistics of all those who suffered no ill. Upon reaching the end of this journey through the darkest secrets and the unforeseen consequences of Egyptian obsession, we must ask ourselves a fundamental question: did they achieve their goal? The ancient Egyptian elite dedicated their entire existence, reoriented the entire economy of their nation, and molded their morality around a single supreme purpose: to conquer death. They wanted to maintain their identity, their body, and their name intact forever in a perfect universe. At first glance, it seems they failed miserably. Their bodies were looted and consumed as medicine, their tombs violated, their treasures melted down or scattered in private collections, and their most intimate secrets were exposed under the cold clinical lights of museums and modern laboratories, far from the sacred darkness they required. However, if we adjust our perspective, the answer becomes more complex and unsettling. Today, 5,000 years after the mythical King Nama unified the two lands, We continue to speak of them with awe. We know their names: Khufu, Ramesses, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten. We know their faces with shocking intimacy thanks to the mummies that survived the destruction. Tutankhamun, a minor king who died young, sick, and probably in the midst of a political crisis, is more famous today across the planet than any president or emperor of the modern era. In a strange and twisted turn of fate, their paranoid obsession with preservation worked, although not in the way they expected. They do not live in the field of reeds, but in the global collective memory, in documentaries, in history books, and in popular imagination. But the price of this form of immortality was humanity itself. To achieve that scale of construction and preservation, they had to develop a system that often stripped society of individual compassion in favor of state order. They had to turn their subjects into tools of mass construction, their own families into genetic laboratories through royal incest to preserve the divine blood, and their religion into a system of control based on the terror of total annihilation in the afterlife. The Egyptian civilization bequeathed us unrivaled aesthetic wonders that still move us, but it also left us an eternal warning written in stone and bone about what happens when absolute power mixes with the delusional belief that a human being can transcend their mortal nature and become a god. Today, the desert sand has covered the scars of the ancient quarries, and the wind has scattered the ashes of the workers' campfires that built the pyramids. But the monuments remain, not only as tributes to an ancestral wisdom, but as gigantic tombstones that mark the exact place where a civilization tried to negotiate with eternity and paid the price with its collective soul. In the end, the pharaohs are not our wise and mystical ancestors. They are a dark mirror in which we look at ourselves. In their excessive ambition to leave a legacy, in their paralyzing fear of death and oblivion, and in their willingness to sacrifice immense resources to secure their place in the future, they are not so different from us in the modern era. Do we not seek digital immortality, obsessed with leaving our mark on social networks, or investing millions in cryogenics and life extension technologies, hoping, like them, to wake up in a distant future? The only difference is that they had the time, the absolute power, and the workforce to take their existential fears to their ultimate physical consequences, building artificial mountains of stone to hide a very simple and universal truth, that they were, after all, men and women terrified by the prospect of disappearing into nothingness. And in that terror, they created a beauty and a darkness that the world can never forget.